Good evening, everybody. Hello, my name is Pat Hubble, and I'm the Candorful co-founder and executive director. I'm really excited to have you all joining us today. Thank you so much for joining this event to honor Veterans Day 2023. We have a great event ahead, but bear with me for just about a minute and a half. Yes, I timed it. While I tell you a little bit about Candorful. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we provide job interview prep for military, veterans, and military spouses. Since launching in 2018, Candorful, with the help of 140 amazing volunteer interview coaches from sponsoring companies, has supported over 3,500 military job candidates with interview prep and practice to help them make a smooth career transition. This support is really essential for keeping military families strong and resilient. I'd like to take a moment to thank our awesome volunteer interview coaches, many of whom are veterans themselves or from military families and possibly attending tonight. You guys are the Candorful magic. And let's all thank our veterans and their families for their service. Thank you so much, and happy Veterans Day a little bit early. Enjoy our fireside chat tonight, but if you are excited about what Candorful does, you can help by donating. We'll be dropping our donation link into the chat throughout our event. Your support makes our impact possible. Thank you also to our really fantastic sponsors who helped us bring this Veterans Day event to you. Our gold sponsors, Booz Allen Hamilton and Amazon. And thank you to our silver sponsors, Groundswell and Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and our bronze sponsors, Digital Beachhead and Activision Blizzard. I'll let you in on a cool secret. Activision Blizzard and Digital Beachhead are providing our trivia prizes for this evening. Guy will tell you more about that shortly. I'm really excited by our guest tonight, Admiral Mike Rogers. But before we meet Admiral Rogers, I'd like to introduce you to tonight's Master of Ceremonies, Guy Snodgrass, retired U.S. Navy commander, former Top Gun pilot, Candorful's board chair, and your moderator for this evening. Guy, so great to have you with us again.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Appreciate the very kind introduction, and very excited to be here doing another fireside chat with you on behalf of Candorful. Very excited about today's topic. I've actually had a chance to chat with our guest a few times on a podcast that I've run in years past about the topic of cybersecurity. So much like Pat mentioned, the overall format for tonight's conversation will be about an hour long. It's going to be a fireside chat format. So a little bit of just a running conversation between myself and Admiral Mike Rogers, and we'll intersperse that with 3 trivia questions along the way. So get your thinking caps on as we get to those. Pat mentioned we do have some prizes. So we've got basically a set for each of those 3 winners. It'll be a digital code for a download of the upcoming Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 game that's going to be released next week. That's been provided by Activision Blizzard. So thank you very much to them. Same thing from Digital Beachhead. They've got a nice little swag bag that's going to accompany that digital code to those 3 winners. So we'll get to those questions here and kick it off in just a few minutes. But over to the main event. So we have Admiral Mike Rogers with us. He has had decades of time spent in the U.S. military, specifically the United States Navy. And we really want to drill in on his last tours of duty. He spent, I believe it was a total of 6 years as both the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and he was also the director of the National Security Agency. So heavily wrapped up not only in the world of cyber, but also in the world of statecraft and intelligence. So couldn't think of a better person to be part of this conversation with us. So, Mike, thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thanks. Your standards are very low, Guy. And remember, to all the participants, you must be present to win for tonight's trivia contest. So.
Very good point, and that is very accurate. So we're going to start with just a softball because, of course, we have veterans all around the world. We have those who are sponsoring and people who just wanted to listen into this conversation. Some may be in the digital arts realm, but others may not be. So from your vantage point, I mean, you've had so much immersion with cyber, but just for the layperson, how would you describe cybersecurity?
So look, cybersecurity to me is trying to mitigate one dimension of risk, both for ourselves as individuals, as well as the businesses that we all support. I think part of the challenge here is we tend to think about this image as, well, cybersecurity is inherently highly technical. Therefore, I must be highly technical and comfortable with a high level of technology. And if I'm not, I therefore have little to provide, and I really can't relate to cybersecurity. I constantly run into that. Doesn't matter if it's the boardroom. It didn't matter if it was the Oval Office or the White House Situation Room in my previous life. And to me, hey, look, we've all got to get beyond this. This isn't about technology as much as this is about how do you mitigate risk.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's funny because in a previous conversation that you and I had, one thing that was alarming is the fact that when it comes to your digital footprint, when it comes to that information that either you as an individual own, the information that a corporation owns, our nation owns, right? All these entities and organizations that are globally dispersed, once that information's been exfiltrated, once someone's had a chance to grab it, they kind of own it forever. It's not like a physical asset that if someone gains access to it, you can just simply recover it and take it back, which I think raises the stakes.
Control in the digital world can be quite illusionary. Unfortunately, you just don't have the degree of control we would all like.
Yeah, 100%. So one thing that I guess would really inform our conversation is you've seen that entire spectrum, right? So I think it's easy when people pick up their newspaper, they open their tablet, they're scouring the news for the day. I mean, it seems like multiple times a week, if not daily, we're reading headlines about a large corporation or the government being a victim of a cyber attack. But what we don't necessarily draw a golden line or that golden thread to is us as individuals. The fact that we are also under attack, that people would like to be able to get our information. So, how do you kind of bridge that divide from a perception standpoint? Because it's probably always easy to say, hey, this is someone else's challenge, someone else's concern, not necessarily my own. But it strikes me that it's probably a challenge that all of us face on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge for us as a nation has been one of the reasons why perhaps we haven't achieved as quite as much focus and collective energy around cybersecurity as we had hoped is for many people, it's just something they don't have to deal with or they haven't had direct exposure to. So, for example, your credit card information is compromised. Hey, you get issued a new card and the bank tells you, look, you have no responsibility for any charges. So for a lot of people, there hasn't been a huge significant direct impact. Now that is clearly changing. And it's certainly been changing for business for a long time.
What would you tell someone who likes to use the exact same password for every website and their password is password?
Well, in my previous life as an individual, so in my previous life, I was part of teams that both defended networks as well as penetrated them. And in my penetrating role, I would say, hey, love people like you because you make the job of the attacker that much easier. As a defender, I would say, what are you thinking? Why are you undermining our collective security here? Because that's part of the challenge here is we think of this as individuals, but the reality is your cybersecurity, your cyber defense is only as strong as the weakest link. And many times that weak link is our user community that just makes bad choices, bad decisions. And the choice of one impacts the security of many.
Well, the companies that not only provide a product that aids in cyber defense, let alone the myriad individuals and organizations that are part of, as you mentioned, testing networks, actively being part of that defense. I always feel for them. They have a special place in my heart because the reality has tended to be over the course of the last few decades that when it comes to the cyber realm, typically attack is going to be a little bit more, I guess, fulsome. It's gonna have better results than defense, right?
It's a little easier than having worked both sides of the street. Being an attacker is definitely a little easier, has a higher probability of success than being a defender.
Yeah, and one of those reasons is something called a zero-day exploit. Can you kind of explain what that is?
So a zero-day is a vulnerability, a security flaw within either the software or hardware of a network structure that the user is unaware of, and therefore the attacker has knowledge of a vulnerability that nobody else knows about, theoretically, i.e. that's the zero-day idea, that no one has awareness of it except for the attacker. Now, I'll be honest and tell you, I can remember during my confirmation hearings to become the director of NSA and the Commander Cyber Command, and that's, 10 years ago now. Man, I just kept getting peppered about, well, isn't this all about 0 days, Admiral? And isn't that the biggest problem we face? And I would say, can I disagree a little bit? Look, 0 days are a significant challenge, but if you look at the amount of activity out there, 0 days, depending on what source you want to use, are probably only 20 to 30% at the most of the total activity we see. The single greatest flaw remains either security that's been poorly applied or bad behavior, bad choices by the user.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of goes along with, to tie off that 0-day point you just made, it probably, especially if you operate in the cyber realm, the reason why you don't see so many 0 days being used is because that's the whole reason to have them in the first place. It's like almost like you're collecting these baseball cards or these capabilities, because once you've used it, once it's out there and you've highlighted that vulnerability, typically, hardware and software manufacturers are racing to try and cover up that previously unknown exploit.
Nation states tend to think that way. Criminal groups, not so much. Criminal groups generally don't hoard 0 days. And again, criminal groups are not the biggest users because they generally rely on bad behavior or poorly applied security is the easiest way for them to gain access.
Yeah. So you mentioned two things right there, which certainly can impact organizations, but as individuals, we all play a part of that, right? So as an organization, whether it's a nation state, a company, nonprofit like Candorful, a big part of that would be your network hardware, your computers, is your software up to date, right? So you mentioned, are you practicing a good hygiene on a recurring basis to ensure that you have the latest and greatest and patched software and hardware that's suitable? The other part, which I think is very intriguing, is kind of that human terrain mapping, understanding how people work. I remember hearing, again, this is probably 10, 15 years ago, but the Russians would leave USB drives, in parking lots, or they just have them out and someone would grab it and say, oh, wow, free USB drive. Let me plug it into my computer at work. And that could potentially download a malicious code that could then get access to a system. So what have you found to be successful for organizations when they're looking to instill those good habits for people who have access to the network?
So number one, you want to make sure you educate your workforce with things like, hey, look, you don't accept hard drives. You don't, for example, for me, if somebody hands me something at a conference or a convention, I'll say thanks, but I'll never use it. I just never use it. And you're right. The first major penetration that the Department of Defense experienced back, 2006, 2007 was KGB lacing of thumb drives that were being handed out in Afghanistan in the bazaars to service members who then uploaded them into their computers. And since many of them were using their work computers to do personal work, because you're a long way from home and you're not necessarily, especially then, you're not deploying with a significant amount of personal gear initially. We were finding viruses both in the young class, but then the part that really was surprising, how did this stuff get into the high side, SIPR and the SCI networks? And again, it turned out people were, loading these hard drives. A very good lesson for us. Fortunately, one we haven't had to experience again significantly within the department anyway.
Yeah, when Mike, for the audience, when Mike references, for example, NIPRNet, SIPRNet, the high side, what he's talking about is the vast majority of users in the U.S. government system are going to be on NIPRNet, which is our unclassified network. And then once you go beyond that, you start adding encryption and other types of ways to safeguard classified information, things that are secret or higher, for example. As we get ready to move on to the next kind of line of questions for you, I did want to take a minute just to pause real quick and throw out our first trivia question to the audience. So for the audience, if you're a huge tech nerd like I've been pretty much my entire life, this one may resonate with you, but there's a fantastic movie from the 1980s called War Games. And so I'm curious if anybody knows what year War Games was released. You're not allowed to play.
Damn it.
Yeah,
you have a winner already.
So obviously, as Pat mentioned, or I guess I should have mentioned, I see responses coming through the chat. I'm seeing several good responses. What's going to happen now? Pat's going to go through the chat. She's going to identify the individual with the first correct response. She'll announce the winner on chat. And then at the very end of our program, she'll make sure that she announces it verbally as we wrap things up. And if you could make sure, she'll probably reach out to you via private chat just to get your mailing information so we can get you the digital code as well as the swag bag. Okay, so back to the conversation. We talked about some of that hygiene. I think that's something that's always good just to put a pin in.
Hey, Guy, one thing before I forget, for bonus points, you should ask the winner to name the computer system that is featured in War Games.
Yeah, and plus we just had Halloween yesterday, so some of you may have received this in your trick-or-treat bags. There we go. We've already got the responses coming in, and I like the fact that most people are spelling it correctly for the acronym. So to put a pin in it, one thing that's kind of crazy, we mentioned briefly that typically speaking, offense is almost always going to win out over defense. And that's because there's always vulnerabilities. There's always ways to penetrate a network. And if you're playing defense, you've got this wall and you're trying to identify the vulnerabilities and you're plugging them. It is such a foot stomper, as we'd say in the military, that, when you think about a network, your organization, your company, your nation, I mean, all these different networks are locked down pretty hard. And all it really takes is one or two or three people who might slip up, and then suddenly you can give an intruder access. So on that note, we've talked about the USB drives. There's another technique called spear phishing. And I was wondering if you could maybe describe what spear phishing is and why it serves as a threat to networks.
Before I describe spear phishing, one other comment, it's a guy, again, who used to be part of teams that penetrated networks for me. The amount of times that system owners improperly applied security, i.e. they thought they had it properly installed and it really wasn't. I have to admit, it really amazed me at times where I just thought, the network administrator, the IT team, they don't really understand, how they've installed this. They haven't really looked at the configuration fully. Hey, it's not, quite as complete as they think it is. So that means there's vulnerability. With respect to spear phishing is a technique designed to use emails, if you will, that individuals open and then click on a attachment, an image, a link. And in so doing, embedded unbeknownst to the individual who has clicked on that link, that image, that attachment, they have now actually uploaded malware into their system that they're unaware of. And the technique used to upload that malware is spear phishing. It's an image thing from, you're actually looking at fish in the water, you're trying to spear them. That's the idea. And it's among the most common techniques right now, for uploading of malware. And the number one purpose of uploading malware at the moment is probably ransomware. It's not the only purpose, because nation states use that for a little different approach. But
yeah, as we were chatting in the backstage area before we went live, Pat mentioned that she has been the recipient of spear phishing attacks. I mean, I think if all of us were to look at our junk mail folders and sometimes our inbox, we would see the same thing. Now they're getting as brazen. I know I've received text messages or iMessages on my phone with, hey, your package was, we're trying to deliver your package to you. Click here to receive. And I'm like, no, this is not passing the sniff check, especially when the grammar is pretty bad. So there's a lot of these attack vectors that, organizations or individuals are trying to use to grab a hold of your stuff. You mentioned something about the fact that
hey, Guy, can I make another comment? I apologize.
Sure, go for it.
One of the implications for all of us as users is, look, the ability of the adversary to produce products that at first blush look very valid, emails, etc., is increasing to the point where, look, guys, we have got to take our time with what we're doing. I mean, the greatest penetration that during my time, and arguably this is so far, we ever had into the Pentagon, for example, the unclassified network backbone, was because 4 individuals, I remember they were blowing, it's typical morning, they're trying to get through their emails before their first meetings, and they end up opening an email, seeing something, and clicking on a link. And when I asked them, I was trying to understand the thought process. So when I approached these 4 individuals, I said, look, we're trying to understand, what was your thought process here? I got, well, sir, you know how it is. You've been on the Joint Staff. We're just super busy. We're trying to get we're trying to get through our emails. And I'm going, guys, I understand that, but in the world we're living in now, you got to be careful about speed when it comes to just blowing through all these products that are sitting in your inbox for you to look at, whether that's your personal inbox or whether that's something associated with your professional life and work.
Yeah. And once again, I mean, it's one of those things that I just can't overstate enough, that it's fascinating that you could have, let's say you're an organization like DoD, and you could have, 2 million people doing everything right, but then you have 4 individuals who were speed clicking through email. They click on the wrong thing. Now they inject malware into the system, and that can expose a vulnerability that another nation state or others can use to grab information or do nefarious things. Right. So, yeah, I mean, it's such a tricky balance to try and strike, because it's not like everyone has to mess up. Just a few people have to make a mistake.
Yeah, I have to admit. So in that particular Russian attack, which we had advance warning about, we knew that they were going to be trying something. they launched 15,000 emails. Of the 15,000, we managed to stop all but about 60 from getting to any users. Of the 60 that got to users out of 15,000, only 4 were actually opened, unfortunately. And they clicked on the attachment, and then the Russians got in.
Yeah. So stepping back real quick, you mentioned about sometimes when system administrators or those who are falling under the CIO's purview, they misapply a patch, or they haven't kept things up to date. One thing that made news last week, I believe it was, is that there are now reporting requirements from the SEC, especially for corporations, that there's a much tighter leash, that if you have been a victim of a cyber attack that is going to have any kind of a material effect, you have to publicly announce that. And I'm wondering, from your purview, will that serve a positive purpose, because basically it's kind of a name and shame type of situation, or does it inject additional vulnerabilities?
I want to make sure I understand the beginning about what would interject additional vulnerabilities. I apologize, Guy. I want to make sure I understand.
Well, yeah, sorry. I should have drawn that one out a little bit more. Part of the article was just simply, I guess, the corporations were pushing back on the reporting requirement and saying, hey, if we acknowledge the attack, especially if we're actively trying to circumvent or counter the attack, we may be giving intelligence to our adversary that we're fighting against. Whether that's a cybercrime network, whether that's a nation state, whoever may be trying to gain access or lock down a network, we don't necessarily want them to know that we're onto their game. So it sounds like there's a bit of a tension between holding corporations accountable for their cybersecurity and their policies, and making sure individuals understand that they have suffered an attack, but then at the same time, not giving away too much information.
Yeah, and the other challenge, I think, if you're in the corporate world, what I would constantly hear, both when I was in government, now that I'm in the private sector, is corporations talking about, look, remember, we have concerns with liability. So if we start to publicly, particularly before we have complete information, if we start to publicly talk about what we're trying to deal with, this may set us up for legal problems later on, when we were merely replying or responding to a, if you will, a standard or a mandate coming from the government, which doesn't absolve us as the company from potential liability concerns. So there has always been this tension. Now, I'll only speak for me, and I've had this discussion with President Obama and President Trump, and one of the things I had told them was, we have got to figure out, why is it that the same attacks, the same methodologies on the part of these actors just keep working over and over again? And I said to them, one of the reasons is, in my experience, in my opinion, is because we refuse to publicly talk about what is happening. So we don't gain the benefit of the pain of others. Instead, we just keep repeating this pain over and over and over again. And so personally, I am an advocate for, look, we need to come up with a methodology that enables us to generate more understanding about what is happening. That includes companies acknowledging what is happening. Now, you can have an argument about what's the timeline that's most appropriate, and what are the specific dimensions of what that disclosure should be. But in general, I always said, why can't we let the pain of one lead to the benefit of many? But the way we do it now, or previously, have been, the pain of one just keeps getting repeated over and over and over again.
Well, I do think that if nothing else, notification will serve some positive role, because of the fact that you're forcing companies to highlight that their cybersecurity practices were, whether it was, due to basically that they were ineffective, or someone was able to get through. So to your point, it's a way to come to the comment, to a table and share best practices, also share vulnerabilities and say, hey, this is what got us, don't let this get you. Which, of course, coming from a military background, we call those lessons learned. It's a way to make sure that we're pushing information out so everyone else can benefit from it.
I will say tangentially, and I see someone in the chat ask this question, there's an interesting issue going on now with the SEC deciding that they're going to take SolarWinds to court. In part, the government's assertion is SolarWinds cyber preparedness was not appropriate, number one, and then number two, they had an awareness of just what their shortfall was, and yet they tried to mask it or hide it. And within the CISO, I spent a lot of time with CISOs, cyber information security officers from companies around the world, and right now this is a huge topic among, hey, is this really true? Is this the standard now? The government's going to come back at us years after an event. In some cases, the government is using, for example, as part of the evidence of their premise, emails that the company provided in which the company and the CISO is saying, hey, look, these are taken totally out of context. Many of them actually are just humorous internal exchanges. What are you doing that you think that based on what you're reading, that the company has some sort of nefarious intent here? But it's really getting a lot of angst. That combined with the Uber court case, hard to believe now, over a year ago. That's another one that's got the CISO community really talking about. So what does it mean as a CISO responsible for cybersecurity? What does it mean to be a corporate officer? What does it mean to execute your cybersecurity responsibilities if you have a CEO or a general counsel who is providing you direction that you don't necessarily agree with or that you don't think is appropriate?
Yeah, no, yeah, you're right. That can open up a whole host of issues. It's probably just because of open versus closed systems, et cetera. I mean, I think there's benefit to at least notifying, especially users of, or if you're a user of Facebook, if you're a user of any online service, but certainly corporations, notification to the end user that your information has been compromised. And I say that because I remember being a little bit frustrated when I was still wearing the uniform, because I've received probably 6 or 7 letters throughout my time, sometimes fairly detailed, saying, hey, your information was leaked. Your personal information was leaked because someone left 2 hard drives in a truck. The truck was broken into. They made off with the hard drives. And so you should consider that information to be compromised. We don't necessarily know if it is or isn't, but you should assume it is. So I remember seeing those letters and thinking, wow, this problem is out of control. But I compare and contrast that to a lot of companies where they'll have these massive data breaches. And unfortunately, whether it's just difficult to notify users, but I won't even know about it. In fact, I think Apple's done a fairly nice job, at least from the ecosystem I'm pretty much in, which is, hey, your password popped up on like a dark website. You probably want to change this. And we joked earlier about if your password is password and use it for every site you visit, but sometimes people do have a small number of passwords that they rotate through every website they visit. And if you get compromised on one website, there's nothing to say they're not trying your username password combo everywhere else. So notification in that case can be a positive. So at least hey, I gotta check the other sites I'm on and make sure I'm taken care of. So we are now about halfway through, or a little bit over halfway through. I wanted to go ahead and move into our second trivia question for the audience. Woo-hoo. So as Mike and some of you may know, there are a lot of government agencies that have cybersecurity as part of their portfolio. But what is the primary agency responsible for investigating cyber crimes in the United States? So we'll let that work its way through. Seeing some good responses come up, and we'll let Pat shoot you the response here after everyone has kind of hit where everything dies down a little bit. So, we talked about kind of on the personal level. Let's zoom out to your expertise, right? Which is working with nation states. I know that with your own practice now, you're still doing some of that kind of work. How do nations view cybersecurity? You mentioned you've been on both the defense and offense side, but kind of how does this impact their calculus?
So look, for nation states, particularly the larger you are, the more digitally focused you are, the more your economy is based on data, the more your connectivity, your economy is based on automation, autonomy, remote connectivity, automated work processes, et cetera. The more that's part of your basic economic model, the greater your concern. Most nation states, take a look at the US, the Five Eyes, others. You're concerned about could cyber undermine the trust that my citizens have in our ability to execute governance, in the ability for them to execute their day-to-day lives, whether that be where cyber uses an instrument against critical infrastructure. Think about power, think about water, think about finance, think about aviation, et cetera. Hey, the economic impact and the quality of life impact and the potential endangerment of life is all potentially significant. You're also worried about the military dimensions of this. Could nation states use this either to negate the US's or other nations' military capacities and generate military advantage if we get to conflict? So there's a reason why almost every nation in the world is investing in cyber, and every nation in the world is talking about cyber.
Well, I know Pat is currently collecting and handling all the responses we receive. She mentioned this at the outset, but as we're about halfway through, just want to remind those who are participating in today's conversation that certainly a lot of what Candorful does to support service members and their families is because not only of you as individuals making a contribution, but certainly the companies and organizations that support us every step along the way. So we do have a quick video we wanted to show you to highlight one of our sponsors, Booz Allen Hamilton. So we'll get that going and we'll rejoin the conversation here in just about a minute.
Wondering what the civilian world has to offer? Where you fit in? If you'll find the same sense of purpose the military has given you. Upskilling into a tech role can be your path to a purposeful and future-focused career. Your leadership experience, passion to serve, and mission expertise make you the perfect fit for a career in tech. We need you to help us defend against cyber attacks, use AI to beat our adversaries, and build the solutions that will enable the next generation of warfighters. Defend the future. Lead with us.
All right. So thanks again to Booz Allen Hamilton for their support of this year's Fireside Chat on cybersecurity. Admiral, as we've talked about some of these vulnerabilities, I mean, I can only imagine. I remember when I was going to grad school for computer science, and one of the things, everyone was licking up about was, at the time, this was the end of late 1990s, early 2000s, and everyone was talking about big data, big data, big data. And the reality was there's only going to be a more insatiable appetite for and demand for data, not less. Like you rarely would see someone saying, I need less data. So likewise, a trend line that has occurred over the decades is, if I think back to my 1980s self with my standalone computer, I've got a 56K, modem, and unless I dial into someplace, I have an air-gapped system, right? So someone would have to gain entry to my house, put in a 5.25 floppy drive, or I'd have to dial up to have someone gain unauthorized access to my computer. Now, Internet of Things, everyone's got a network, everything is exposed to the internet. Where do you think that trend is going to put us as we continue to design systems that are so network intensive, that have such a large surface contact area with potential threats?
Part of our challenge is, look, we are going to double down on a system that has inherent vulnerability. Remote access, remote connectivity, highly automated, operating technologies, not just IT, but OT, and systems built increasingly around the idea of the constant movement, constant access of massive amounts of data. That means the very fundamental premise of the economic models that we're building, of the way we're building our own personal lives, we are accepting fundamental vulnerability as a foundational premise. The idea being, hey, the benefits far outweigh the challenges. I think it also calls for, and you see this reflected in the new cyber strategy that the Biden administration released in March, this idea that system developers, whether they be developers of hardware, whether they be developers of software, that those who are developing these capabilities that we count on as the fundamental building blocks of this highly automated, networked world that we're living in, that they have a responsibility, that is not just the individual users, it is not just the individual network owners. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you're referring to is something called DevSecOps, right? It's being able to develop things in a secure environment where you think about security from the outset, as opposed to trying to cobble or patch things as they've gone
Bolt it
down
out
the road.
afterwards, yeah.
Yep. So, obviously there's all these ways that you can kind of penetrate. Like you said, if with the explosion of network of available devices, it just seems like something that we're going to have to really contend with, because I'll never forget, we brought on as our Deputy Secretary of Defense, back when I was working for Secretary Mattis, we brought in Deputy Secretary of Defense, Pat Shanahan. He had been an executive vice president at Boeing, and we had this
Boeing guy.
Yeah, we had a fascinating conversation, and Mattis is out of the office before we were going to go in and see the boss. And he was talking about autonomous vehicles. He's like, man, this is going to be so amazing. This is back in 2017. He's like, this is going to be so amazing because at some point we'll have enough vehicles that are autonomous that you can do smart traffic management. You could basically, you could have a knowable grid of where all available parking spots are. So as you navigate to your destination, your vehicle already knows where it's going to berth, as opposed to having to hunt for 10, 15 minutes, if it's really congested. All these things. I remember he was just so excited about the possibilities, and I kind of deflated his tire a little bit because I said, hey, if I'm an attacker, I love that, because imagine the kind of stuff I can do to you, to your citizens, to anybody else, if I can get into that network and suddenly you're generating collisions, you're gumming up the works, and now everyone who has this normal flow of traffic, they're kind of they're really messed up there. So again, I guess just to highlight that this is a trend that people are going to have to be aware of as we move forward.
Yeah, there is no doubt. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. Now, the hope is that emerging technologies and much better designs, things like AI, quantum, et cetera, are going to help us change the current dynamic. The challenge is those technologies, AI, quantum, for example, will have both positive implications. They'll make us better from a cybersecurity perspective, but they also will represent challenge. They will provide more knowledge and insight to adversaries who are attempting to penetrate our system. So, I'm one of those who is, I don't think that there's only a technology answer to this. And I don't think there's one single technology that's going to come along that's going to make everything super secure, and we're just not going to have to worry about cybersecurity anymore. I doubt that is what is going to unfold. I'd love to be wrong in that one, but I doubt it.
I don't think you will be. You mentioned this, and I was going to get there, AI. So certainly there's probably a significant role for AI with defense of networks, defensive systems, but also offense. How do you see that, in the near term and then going into the far term or the longer term view? How do you see AI and its role with cyber?
So look, you're already seeing AI used for development of malware. Using that technology to attempt to anticipate defensive structures and therefore to develop malware that's optimized for a specific configuration or particular defensive approach that a network user is implementing. You're seeing AI used in social engineering now, as we're, in the case of attackers trying to develop spear phishing and malware that is acceptable, so to speak, is perceived as legitimate, has a higher probability of actually being uploaded because the user thinks it's valid. On the other hand, I'm watching AI being used by cyber defenders to attempt to simulate criminal or nation state behavior to a greater extent, trying to consider a broader set of attack scenarios, trying to consider a broader set of options that others might use. So like most technologies, to me, there will be very good things about it, and there will also be challenges associated with it. It's not just quote good or just bad. That's just not the way it works, I don't think.
Yeah, I know even yesterday when President Biden had unveiled the executive order regarding AI, one of the things that highlighted, amongst several things, but it was his alarm at seeing just how fast deepfake technology had progressed. The fact that, that's another, to your point about spear phishing or spear phishing-like attacks, where suddenly, you can imagine if you get a text and it looks like it's coming from a family member and it's got them in a photo, or they're saying, I need help, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of ways that attack space could be expanded.
Yeah, and I mean, they are combining text, video, audio. I mean, it is the level of sophistication is really quite amazing when you look at some of the stuff that's out there.
Yeah, to put that into context, when I was still wearing uniform and I was still flying actively, a family member sent me a picture or a video, actually, clip of a F-35 that took off from a carrier, did a backflip, and then landed. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea it could do that."
I didn't know we could do that.
Yeah, I'm like, that's from a video game, actually. That's not even a real plane doing a real thing. And they're like, really? So to your point, as you start taking these various technologies, now maybe one text message would stand out as being fake, but when you combine it, like you just said, with all these other elements where you're like, man, this looks pretty authentic. This looks real. It's going to have a potential to kind of saturate that marketplace. The other thing with AI that'll be fascinating is to your point about offense and defense. On the offense side, you could imagine it being a little bit like what we've just experienced the last couple of years, the coronavirus, right? When it first hit, and then suddenly you had the Delta variant, then you had the Omicron variant, all these variants as the virus itself. And so similarly, as you mentioned with AI, people are using AI to write computer code and to change software on the fly. You could imagine that being the case with offensive cyber attacks, where you're able to essentially take your base code, whatever you had, but as you actually are hitting the wall, as you're trying to gain entry into a system, you're able to change that code on the fly in order to try and overcome those defenses in a way that almost like a rolling code, right? Where the defense can't actually sustain that attack, but as the attacker, it can make you a little bit more powerful.
Yeah, one of the things that I also find really interesting about AI is it's the first technology that I can think of where the developers, so think about the private sector, it's not being developed predominantly in government, it's being developed primarily in the private sector, where the private sector has come to government and said, you know, we need your help here. You have got to regulate this. You have got to set up oversight and control. I mean, we've had some developers in the corporate world arguing, for example, you need to create a government agency to oversee this. I'm trying to remember the last time that I saw the technical world come to the government and argue, hey, you really got to get involved and regulate this thing. I don't ever remember another technology except for AI that's been the case, which is very interesting. So now, what is the expectation for government and a legal framework, regulatory frameworks, particularly when government doesn't have a lot of expertise in this, and they're not the driver for this technology, the private sector is. And at a time when right now the private sector and government don't necessarily have the best of relations at the moment, particularly in the tech world.
And I remember we had some pretty fulsome discussions around what you just said. Hey, the government's not necessarily optimized to regulate a technology that is moving much faster than the speed of government typically moves. But then also, what about other nation states? I know one thing that we always discussed was if we overly regulate AI, if we focus, as we should to an extent, on the ethical use of AI and regulations surrounding it, but if other nation states aren't doing that, if they're just going as fast as they possibly can to make advancements, that could over time put us at a disadvantage from a technological standpoint because they had unfettered access to data, they had unfettered access to develop these systems in a way that our regulations might put us at a disadvantage.
Yeah, it is interesting. Most of the democratic states around the world have focused on the moral, ethical, and safety dimensions of AI. Let's make sure this doesn't get out of control. Let's make sure this doesn't create harm. If you look at the way the authoritarian states, that's not what they're talking about with AI at all. I mean, they tend to focus on, hey, how do we make AI more productive, both from an economic as well as a national security perspective? It's interesting to see the two kind of broad approaches that you're seeing around the world.
Yeah, if I'm North Korea, I could probably care less what anybody thinks about what I'm doing with cyber. I just want it to be as effective as possible. There's been all these hacks where North Korea has been able to exfiltrate Bitcoin, exfiltrate money, transfer it out of accounts, et cetera. So to your point, it's an interesting dichotomy that exists there. One of the things, back from my podcasting days that I've always loved to do is when I'm interviewing someone, say, what haven't I asked you yet? What's the thing that, you can have a conversation about cybersecurity and it's so broad in scope and, we pick on some things that are interesting or maybe we saw in the news recently, but what are things as someone who's been a practitioner for more than a decade that you think would be important for us to really know or understand?
So I always thought, and I'll tell you exactly what I used to tell the leadership of our nation, the single greatest challenge for us in cybersecurity is not technology. The single greatest challenge for us is how do we change culture? If you want to get long-term sustainable change, then that is about culture. That isn't just about technology. And it's not just about how big are the checks that we write. This is about more than money. This is about how do we change our society, our businesses, our own personal practices around cybersecurity. And that's going to be pretty foundational. It isn't something that we're just going to bolt on at the end. And I always thought that there wasn't enough appreciation of that. I would continually get, well, Admiral, isn't this in the end just going to be solved by technology? And I'm going, I don't think so. Anything developed by man can be defeated by man. So if you think there's some perfect technology that's totally incorruptible, that nobody can potentially overcome, I don't think it's likely. And you're going to see that play out with commercial encryption, for example, as we get into an era where quantum capacity, quantum capability gets to the point where the last couple decades where the ability of conventional computational capability to power through commercial grade encryption just doesn't exist. That potentially is not going to be the case as we look in the future. So what does that mean for us and how are we going to prepare for that?
Well, and you mentioned culture, so I was kind of smirking just a little bit because I was like, well, what'd you come up with, Admiral? Because you're right, culture is such a challenge. And I think your example of the 4 individuals speed reading their email and just clicking on the malware accidentally is very instructive because, again, you could implement a lot of controls or processes or procedures to try to do the best you can for culture, but one person, two people, four people, click on malware and now it's through, and your organization is now a victim of exfiltration or, of course, ransomware, which we didn't really get into too much. But my brother is a administrator for a school district here in Texas. They've been hit twice by ransomware that locked everything down, and they had to find their way through that one. So, how did you come up
I'll
with
tell you what I used to
practices
tell
for
them.
culture?
I said, number one, we need to incentivize the behaviors that we want to see. I said, we need to be rewarding people who are making smart choices and who are taking appropriate action. We need to reward them, and we need to publicize that. Number two, never forget the power of pain sometimes. The example I used was, so those 4 users in the Pentagon, I said, we control their system access. We control the latency of the network. What if we watched people, for example, in our quarterly or monthly spear phishing tests, where we test our employees, try to educate them to the dangers of clicking on spear phishing emails. And what if we said to ourselves, so everybody who clicks on an email more than twice in a 6-month period, guess what? We're going to put a latency factor in that slows your network performance down. My argument always was, nobody likes the hourglass of death. It is amazing how people tend to get their attention and get their focus when they're worried about, damn, it's taking me a lot longer than I would like to read all my emails. I said, some combination of incentive as well as some combination of pain. To me, in my experience, that's how you really change behavior. That's how you really sustain cultural changes over time.
Yeah, and I think consistency is there. I remember one of the sayings that I always enjoyed when I first started flying planes. My instructors would always talk about repetition teaches the donkey. They're like, hey, just over and over and over again. Yeah. And if you just focus on cybersecurity, say once in a quarter or once in a year, it's kind of hard to instill that culture. I'm looking at the clock here where we've got about 15 or maybe 10 minutes left of the conversation.
We got any more trivia questions?
I was going to say, we've got our final trivia question. So you're Johnny on the spot. We've talked about this. In fact, you've heard the Admiral mention this term a couple times already, but let's see if you were paying attention. What is the term for gathering information about a target system with the intent to locate or identify vulnerabilities? So that is your trivia question. And we'll see if we get some answers coming through. While people are responding, we do have a final video from a sponsor we'd like to play for you. So this will be coming from Amazon, and we want to certainly thank them for their support of Candorful and this evening's event.
Progress. We hear about it a lot, but what does it actually look like? Is it innovation, sustainability, robotics? Or is it diversity, equality, equity, empowerment? Amazon's Reliability and Maintenance Engineering organization is a dedicated team of engineers and problem solvers working to deliver highly efficient systems. Progress is what we do. But it's not only technical excellence. It's about creating new opportunities, supporting growth, dreaming big, and achieving your goals.
All right, welcome back as we finish the final portion of our discussion with Admiral Mike Rogers on cybersecurity. As the Amazon video is playing, I was scrolling through the chat to see if some interesting questions have been posed. And I didn't necessarily run across a great question, but I saw a great comment, which is that someone wrote that this is a fireside chat, and I am literally sitting next to a fireplace because of how cold it is right now in Atlanta, Georgia. Thought that was fantastic. So it sounds like you've got the right setting for a fireside chat. So we talked about culture. We've talked about kind of, the scale or the scope as it goes from a nation state all the way down to an individual. If you think about cybersecurity, and you've touched on this a little bit, but I guess to put a finer point on it, what is one area that you see a lot of promise and you feel very enthusiastic about? And then what's another area on the flip side that you are concerned about as it relates to cybersecurity, looking, say, 1 to 3 years down, in the time horizon?
Jack, boy, just off the top of my head. So one thing that I feel positive about is there is recognition both within the corporate world and the governments that cybersecurity is both significant, important, a priority and requires allocation of resources. And government, for example, I would argue, boy, particularly in the last couple of years, has gotten a lot more aggressive about trying to identify what its role from a regulatory and oversight perspective. The part that the part that I find a little frustrating is, again, most bureaucracies tend to view that the fundamental approach is sound, and what you want to do is just keep tweaking the approach. And my view is, guys, this approach broadly that we've been doing, I can't find a single metric where is an indicator of success. Attacks aren't going down. Penetrations aren't going down. Capability of nation states criminals aren't going down. So part of me goes, rather than continuing to double down on approaches and methodologies that really haven't worked, can't we take the benefit of this experience that we've had and ask ourselves, what might we want to do fundamentally differently? Now, that's not the way bureaucracies work. Doesn't matter if that bureaucracy is in the private sector or if it's in government, in my experience. But I'm just a fan of, guys, I think we need to acknowledge that we need to take a different approach in some areas.
Yeah, it's gonna be a challenge. And I actually, as you were saying that, I wrote down risk versus reward. And, I wrote that because of the fact that if I think through history, I always think kind of intelligence and spycraft, but this applies now to the greater cybersecurity standpoint. That is 1960s, 1970s. If you wanted to gain access to information, you typically had to physically infiltrate someone's location. You had to break in, you had to steal something, you had to try and maybe co-opt someone and turn them into an agent who can work on your behalf, right? There was a fairly significant level of personal risk or professional risk involved in that pathway. Fast forward to 2023 and beyond, I mean, you could be a random individual with some coding skills sitting in a cyber cafe with a fair level of anonymity.
Yeah, cyber is the great equalizer. You don't need billions of dollars. You don't need tens of thousands of people, and you don't need a decade of development. That's not the way it works. Hey, one other thought before I forget. One of the things that I see going forward is cybersecurity, to me, will become much more about creating resilience than it will be about focusing on cyber defense. If you define cyber defense as those steps that you take to harden your networks, to improve your ability to stop an unauthorized access by a non-valid user, whether it's a criminal group, an individual, or a nation state. I think increasingly we need to focus more and more on this idea of, look, if there's a high probability, given the fact there's a high probability that a determined adversary is got a high probability of success in penetrating your network. So to me, it becomes about, so if that's true, it's much more about, so how do I create resilience? How do I create the ability to forestall their ability to move quickly within my network? How do I forestall the ability of them to extract information once they're inside the network? How do I create a faster recovery time? That, to me, is a much better use of focus and resources. I'm not arguing you should walk away from cyber defense. That's not what I mean. But I do think creating resilience, and that's about a lot more than just your IT and OT segments. It's a lot more than just your CISO and your CIO. That is a corporate, a kind of approach that involves leadership from the top all the way down to the user community.
You've mentioned that term twice now, and it's one I'm actually not familiar with. You mentioned IT and then OT. What is OT?
So IT is information technology. OT is operating technology. So when you think about IT, think about your basic network infrastructure, emails, connectivity, those networks that we do to do basic business functions. That really has been traditionally the focus of cybersecurity. But what you're finding now is OT, operating technology, those systems, those functions that we have created that are highly automated, remotely controlled, remotely accessible.
Like a SCADA system.
Right, an industrial control system. Think about, automobile manufacturers with totally automated automobile production, for example, really minimize the human footprint. All of that, hey, great productivity, great speed, potentially greater precision, but there's a flip side to that. That's potentially greater vulnerability. You're starting to see criminals go after OT infrastructure, SCADA, ICS, other things that quite traditionally, 5 years ago, you never saw. It just wasn't their focus. Put it another way, if you think a company's willing to pay to regain access to their data, what do you think a company would be willing to pay to regain connectivity and basic infrastructure control?
Yeah.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, we spanned a whole wide variety of topics tonight. Admiral, I really appreciate your time with us to walk us through it. I think as I've taken some notes, I think the statement you made, which was my favorite by far, is that cybersecurity is the great equalizer. I love that point that you don't need billions of dollars. It doesn't matter your, race, gender, ethnicity, your background, your experience. All those things kind of go out the door. If you've got the technical know-how and the ability, then that's going to play a huge role, whether you're on the offense or the defense side of that.
Some of the best cybersecurity professionals that I ever dealt with was honored to be on the same team. They didn't have formal education. They didn't have a master's degree. So there's a spectrum of backgrounds here that we've got to bring together to create enhanced cybersecurity. It isn't just about, well, everybody's got to go to college. Everybody's got to get a master's degree in computer science or cybersecurity.
As I say,
My
direct
opinion,
inject.
anyway, my experience.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your time, and I want to turn the baton back over or hand it back over to Pat real quick so she can chat with us about the winners of the 3 trivia questions and to thank our sponsors.
Take it away, Pat.
Mike, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Oh my God, this was so much fun. I've learned so much and gotten a little bit more nervous, of course, about, those phishing emails. And now I'm just not going to touch anything. I think coaches, if you don't hear from me for a while, it's because I'm afraid to check my email. So, okay. Before I announce our trivia prize winners, I really want to thank you, Mike. I really, truly appreciate this. This was really great. I'm overwhelmed with how much we've learned tonight. And by the way, I'm all about incentives and pain. I agree with this. We need to use more of this throughout life. So thank you for those analogies. I want to thank our sponsors one more time. Our gold sponsors, Amazon and Booz Allen Hamilton. Our silver sponsors, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, Groundswell. And our bronze sponsors, Activision Blizzard and Digital Beachhead. You guys just make it so we can continue bringing Candorful to our transitioning military, our veterans and military spouses, and helping them make that nice transition. So let's get to those trivia prize winners. I think if you've been paying attention in the chat, you probably see it. So War Games, the answer was 1983, and Brandon Buckner, you won that. And for the next one, FBI, John Luke, if I'm pronouncing your name right. Thanks, John. This is great. And then the third one is a little bit of controversy about it, but penetration testing was the result that I looked up, and Stephen Elliott, one of our Candorful coaches, got that. And we're going to just stick with that and go with it. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
And remember, the name of the computer in War Games was the Whopper, WOPR, as some in the chat pointed out.
Awesome. And I haven't seen it, so I think that's on the docket for this weekend is War Games. So thank you guys for giving us something to do. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, sponsors Guy and Mike. Thank you so much. This is just so incredible to have people like you supporting Candorful. Thank you all.